Do your hips feel tight all the freaking time, particularly when you're doing squats, deadlifts, or even just going out for a run? Well, today's video is going to focus on improving your hip mobility. Specifically speaking, we'll be working on improving hip internal rotation. This is a range of motion that a lot of people have problems with developing. So today we'll be going over some stretches, some mobility drills, and some ways to making this hip mobility a permanent thing in your body by increasing your baseline levels of hip internal rotation. So let's take a look. Hip internal rotation is basically when the thigh rotates inwards towards the body, and you'll actually notice that when this occurs, the foot will move outwards. So a lot of people think the opposite, where the foot moves inwards towards the body, that's hip internal rotation. But when your foot moves inwards, it's actually hip external rotation. Hip internal rotation is really needed when it comes to stabilizing the hip, particularly when you're doing athletic activities. When you're lacking hip internal rotation, it can actually produce impingement-like symptoms. So basically you can get functional hip impingement, which will be reflected like a pinching or tension symptoms along the front and outer aspects of your hip. The muscles responsible for hip internal rotation are the gluteus minimus muscles, the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius muscles, and the TFL or the tensor fascia latae muscle. Hip internal rotation could sometimes be lacking because these muscles are either overworked and you need to stretch them out, or because you just haven't trained your hip internal rotators at all. So functionally, they don't know how to activate to stabilize your hip while you're in that position. For today's video, we're going to be taking 3 different steps or 3 different approaches at developing your hip mobility. The first thing that we'll be taking a look at are hip stretches that will help to increase your hip internal rotation. The second thing we'll be doing is activation of your muscles to actively push you into hip internal rotation. The third thing we'll be looking at is actually strengthening your hip internal rotators. By the time you actually get to the point where you can strengthen the hip internal rotators, the baseline levels of your hip mobility will pretty much be full always. That is to say, unless you let yourself get deconditioned over time. Just like any other part of your body, if you stop working it, you'll start losing it. When it comes to hip mobility and internal rotation, what we're looking to achieve is at least 45 degrees of hip internal rotation. It is important to note that when you're progressing through these different types of exercises, that you only really need to focus on one group of exercises. What that means is if you need to work on flexibility, you only need to do the flexibility exercises until those are completely easy to do. Then you move on to the activation and mobility exercises until those are completely easy to do, and then you work on the resistance exercises. So you do these in phases. You don't need to do all of it all at once, because chances are you won't be able to, because your baseline levels of mobility, they kind of require the previous stage to be well established before you can move forwards. So chances are you may need to revisit this video so you could figure out how to work on the next step that you need to work on. If you're unsure about where you need to start from the beginning. And if that's easy, just go on to the second phase. And if that's easy, then go on to the last phase, which is just the resistance training that we're going to be doing. Let's get started with some stretches. All right, the first exercise that we're going to be doing is a assisted stretch. We're going to be using a broomstick. If you don't have a broomstick like this, you can use anything like a golf club, a hockey stick, use your Swiffer if you need to. But basically, we're going to use this to help us with our hip internal rotation. And this is because if you don't have that hip internal rotation flexibility, you have to use something to help kind of push you into that new range of motion that you don't currently have. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take one end of that stick and we're going to kind of weave it through our leg. Starting from the outside of our thigh, we're going to kind of angle it so that it contacts the inner aspect of our ankle. From there, you're just going to kind of anchor it against the inner aspect of that heel, and you're going to kind of pull that stick inwards to kind of pull your leg into that internal rotation. What you should feel are some of your hip external rotators kind of stretch out here. If you feel a bit of a cramp, just breathe through it. You're feeling that cramp because this is a new range of motion that you haven't felt in a little while. If the cramp is too intense, just back off that stretch a little bit. Let it rest for about 10 to 15 seconds, and then let's go into that stretch again, and it shouldn't cramp nearly as much. When we're doing these hip stretches using this exercise dowel, you want to hold the stretch for about 20 to 30 seconds. And the stretch should be at a light to medium intensity. So don't go into a really intense stretch because that'll defeat the purpose. You want to try to teach your body to relax and appreciate that stretch rather than trying to push through it with all your might. So we're going to go for one more repetition. For this type of stretch, you usually want to do this daily, by the way. You're going to be doing about 3 repetitions, 30-second holds, 30-second break in between, just so that you can kind of really stamp into your system that this is a new range of motion that you'll want to train. Next, we're going to be doing another hip internal rotation stretch, except for we're going to go from a hip flexion position, which we're in right now, into a hip neutral position. And you can do this just lying down on your back on a yoga mat. I'm going to use my table. All right, so this is called a supine TFL stretch. What we're going to do is we're going to lie down in a crook-like position. So the hip that you're trying to target, that one's going to be the one that has a knee bent. From there, you're just going to lie down on your back. You're going to take your opposite heel and you're going to place it on the outer aspect of that target hip's knee. From there, you're going to straighten out the leg a little bit so you have a soft bend in that knee. And you're going to use your good leg to pull that knee into internal rotation here. You should feel that stretch right along the front of your hip, kind of where your TFL is located, and your gluteus minimus as well. You're going to hold the stretch for about 30 seconds ago, just like the last exercise that we did. And after that 30-second count, you're going to just back off, chill out for 30 seconds. If you want, you could just target the other side. Might as well do both hips. And after 30 seconds of that, you can go right into the target hip once more. All right, now that we finished doing those hip flexibility exercises, basically the assisted stretches, now it's time to do some activation drills. We'll start off with some easy ones and then we'll progress into some more difficult ones next. All right, so the first exercise that we'll be doing to kind of start activating the hip internal rotators is called the 90-90. We're kind of going to be using this more of a warm-up rather than the actual exercise drill. And this is so that we can get some blood flow into those tissues so that they don't cramp as much when we're doing the actual mobility drills or the end range strengthening drills that we're going to work on next. To get started, what you're going to do is take a seat, make sure you're on a padded surface. If you don't have one at home, using a yoga mat is really handy. Lean back with your hands and you're going to kind of open up your legs and your heels to wider than shoulder distance apart. You want to make sure you have a 90-degree bend in both knees as well. And from there, you're going to just rotate both of them into the same direction. So actually one hip is going to go into internal rotation. The other one's going to go into external rotation. And as you do that, try to keep your bum as close to the floor as possible. So you don't want to be hiking your butt up, try to keep that low. And you're going to go until your knee can tap the floor. Now, chances are, if you're lacking hip internal rotation, this part is going to be pretty difficult for you to do. And that's okay. If you can only get partway there, that's okay for now. You're going to work on your baseline, but the ultimate goal is to be able to get that knee to tap the floor without raising your butt completely off the ground. You're going to hold that for just about 5 seconds or so, and then you're going to alternate sides. You're going to bring it back out to neutral and then out into external rotation, and then your opposite hip is going to go into internal rotation. And what we're going to really want to do is do about 10 to 15 repetitions, just going in and out of this movement. Really focus on your breathing, kind of get the muscles to relax. If it's cramping a little bit, you can back off a little bit. But if you can manage to kind of breathe through the cramp, that's probably the most ideal. Once again, muscles only really cramp when they're kind of deconditioned. So what we're doing right now is we're conditioning them. We're trying to get them used to movement, especially if they're the type to only really weight train or sit down outside of weight training. You don't really play too many sports. Hip internal rotation tends to be a bit of a challenge for most people. The next exercise that we'll be doing is called the tactical frog. Now, this is where we're actually training your hip mobility. So everything up to this point was just flexibility, activation, or warm up, and now we're actually going to work your end ranges. So mobility is about controlling the end range of your hip mobility, particularly in today's video, hip internal rotation. So we're going to be doing that through this exercise. To get started, you do want to have a mat because you don't want to bust up your knees by going on a hard surface. So try to grab a pretty decent yoga mat. I'm going to put it kind of horizontal to my body because I do need to get my knees to be pretty wide apart. So what we're going to do, start in a kneeling position, and you're going to go pretty wide with your hips. So I'm going to go at least shoulder distance, if not wider apart. From there, I'm going to kind of rock back onto my heels, and then I'm going to come down onto my elbows, okay? Next, I'm going to target, for the purpose of this video, my left hip here into internal rotation. To do so, keep the knee pinned to the mat, and you're going to raise a foot away from the body, just like that. And so you're going to feel these outer hip muscles really start activating. And while you're doing this exercise, you're looking for about 45 degrees of that rotation. Really try to hold those end ranges. You're going to feel like cramp a little bit, but keep it active. Hold the contraction. We're going to go for about 4-second hold, come back down, chill out for another 2 seconds or so, and then go right back into it. For this exercise, I like to go for higher repetitions. So we're going to go for about 15 to 20 repetitions. And you'll be doing about 2 to 3 sets. And you can be doing this daily if needed, okay? And you could do both at the same time as well. Kind of looks like this. And actually I recommend doing both at the same time, as this will prevent you from just hiking your hip up too much and bending through the back, because you'll be doing both at the same time. So you won't really get the opportunity to kind of cheat through your spine or cheat by using your pelvis instead. All right, so we're going to be revisiting one of those earlier movements that we did, where we did the assisted internal rotation, except for now, we are going to be using your own muscles to move it instead of using a stick to move you into internal rotation. For this exercise, you're going to need something like a foam roller, or if you don't have a foam roller, you can use a yoga block. And if you don't have a yoga block, you can just roll up a towel until it's a thick, dense cylinder, okay? So what we're going to do is place that foam roller between both your knees, and what we're going to do is use this as a stabilization point so that you're not kind of cheating up the kinetic chain to get your hip into internal rotation. From there, just holding that in place, you're going to take your foot and rotate it as far into hip internal rotation as you can. You're going to feel these outer hip muscles activate and contract real hard to hold you there. I want you to hold a maximal contraction. So you're going to be, once you kind of reach that end range, you're going to be pushing as hard as you can to really get those muscles engaged, and then you're just going to slowly relax, okay? For this exercise, we're going to again go for a 4-second contraction, but you do want to have a ramping period, and this is so you can ease your way into the contraction. So as I'm going to here, I'm kind of slowly going from like 10 to 30 to 50 to 75 to 100% activation, and then I'm going to be ramping back down slowly in terms of the muscle contraction before I let go, okay? So once again, we're going to go again, and we're going to be doing about 10 to 15 repetitions, about 2 to 3 sets daily. And you could do all the sets kind of all at once with a 1-minute break in between, or you could kind of do a split up in the day. If you want to do it one set in the morning, one set in the afternoon, one set in the evening, it doesn't really matter. I just want those 3 sets in daily so that we can kind of get these muscles to get conditioned, get comfortable, get used to this movement. As you may notice that, once again, if you're the type to cramp with those previous exercises, you may cramp with this exercise as well. But just think of those cramps as gains to be made, okay? So progress looks like basically those cramps disappearing over time. You can move on from this exercise when the cramps go away, even at baseline, with no warm up, that the cramps aren't there when you're doing this exercise. Okay, so we'll be moving on to our next phase of movements or exercise for establishing that hip internal rotation range of motion, and that is by doing some resistance training for the same movements. All right, so the first exercise that we'll be doing for resistance training of the hip internal rotators is going to be utilizing loop band or a mini band. What we're going to do is just place this around both of your feet, and you're going to actually lie down on your stomach this time. So you want to have a comfortable surface like a yoga mat or carpet even. I'm going to use my physio table because it's the most comfortable thing ever, but you can also do this on your bed. So from there, you're going to just lie down on your belly, and you're just going to bend both knees to about 90 degrees. From here, one leg at a time, you're just going to pull that band by moving the hip into internal rotation. You want to get that 45-degree angle going on. You're going to hold that for about 4 seconds, and then you're going to come back in. You're going to pull it back out, hold it for 4 to 5 seconds, and you're going to come back in. All right, so for the last hip strengthening exercise that we're going to be doing for our hip internal rotators, we're going to be using a mini band or a loop band to help us. And once again, we're going to grab that foam roller that we used earlier, and we're going to place it between our knees. But before you do that, you're going to put this band around both of your feet, just like that. And then you're going to once again place that foam roller between your knees. You can hold that in place with your hands, and you're going to just bring your leg into hip internal rotation. You're going to feel the resistance of the band really engaging your hip internal rotators. You're going to feel pretty active, and once again, it can maybe even cramp on you if you're not really sufficiently warmed up. When you're doing this exercise, you still want to make sure you're hitting the full range of motion. So if you find that adding resistance, all of a sudden your range of motion's cut down in half, or you lose 5 degrees, you are technically not ready for this exercise yet. You should go back to the phase 2 where you're still working on the end range strength until you can reintroduce the band and have that full strength at the end range of the motion. If you're finding that the band that you're using is a little bit too easy to do, or this exercise is pretty easy for you to do, all you gotta do is use a thicker band. Really, I also want you to make sure that you're not kind of cheating through the movement by kind of lifting up that same side off the table or the chair that you're on. You want to make sure that that's firmly planted so that you're really just targeting the hip internal rotators. When it comes to establishing good hip internal rotation strength through resistance training, we're going to be changing up the frequency of these exercises. So where the first 2 sets of exercises, the flexibility and the activation exercises, were done daily, we're going to be pivoting away from that, and now we're going to be doing it about 3 times a week. This is because the resistance training, just like doing any resistance training in the gym, is going to require some time for those muscles to recover. Technically, it's going to take at least 48 hours for those muscles to recover from the exercises. So that's why we're doing 3 times a week or almost every other day. When we're doing these exercises, aiming for about 3 sets, 15 repetitions is a good benchmark. But if you find that you can only do about 10 repetitions, or if you can even do up to 20 repetitions, by all means, go for it. That's completely okay. It really depends on how strong your hip internal rotators are today. Another thing that you really want to keep in mind with resistance training in general is that you want to make sure you give yourself sufficient rest between sets. Basically, you want to be giving yourself at least 1 minute to 1.5 minutes of rest between sets, and this is so that you can do the appropriate exercise intensity when you're actually training up these muscles. With regards to what exercise intensity you want to be aiming for, we like to use a system called rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. Basically, you want it to be at about 6 out of 10 difficulty. This is completely subjective to what you think is hard or what you think is easy, but this is the best system that we can operate with. If you are doing RPE of 6 out of 10, trust me, you're going to want that 1 to 1.5 minutes of rest between sets. If you find that you can get away with less rest than that, you're probably not hitting an RPE of 6 out of 10. The reason why we want to aim for a 6 out of 10 RPE is because this is going to give you the best tissue adaptation effect without really pushing you to the threshold of high risk of injury. All right, everyone, that wraps up our hip mobility video. If you like the content that you saw today, please give this video a like. If you have any questions about any alternate exercises that you can do, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.